Welcome to this super fast quickie CSS Crash Course that will teach you all that you need to know about CSS in less than 5 minutes. So if you just need to learn this in a rush, or if you already learned it but it's been a while, you're in the right place. If things are going a bit too fast, then there's a full course that goes over the same topics but at a way slower pace and in much greater detail linked in the description. Since CSS is all about shaping the looks of your HTML, you should learn at least a little bit of HTML before you jump into this. We have a 4-minute video just like this one that quickly goes through HTML, it's linked in the description, and of course we have a full version of that as well that goes through it in greater depth. So now that you know HTML, let's get into some CSS. It stands for Cascading Style Sheets and it's a domain-specific language built with the sole purpose of designing the visuals of an HTML document in a browser. In other words, you can make any website look in any way you want with CSS. The general syntax is made up of selectors, properties, and values. An example of a selector would be h1, which would simply let you define the properties for how h1 headers would look on your site. A simple example of a property and value could be something like the color and red. Remember that CSS is text-centric, so the color property pertains to the color of the text, not the background. You have to use the background color property for that. There are 3 different ways that you can insert CSS into your HTML. You can use the style attribute on an element to just define properties. You can use the style element inside an HTML document, or you can use a link element to import an external CSS file into your HTML document. That's generally the way you want to do it, since you want your authors writing HTML and your designers writing CSS without touching each other's files. Let's talk about selectors. You can simply write out the name of an element, or you can use a dot followed by a class name, or a hashtag followed by an ID. Remember that an ID is specific for one element, whereas a class can be used on several elements, and you can have several classes on a single element. If you want to select elements that have a specified combination of selectors, like a div with the class red, or something that has both the class red and the class blue, then you write those selectors after each other without any space between. Spaces are used for nesting, so if I wrote .red and .blue with spaces in between, then the browser would look for elements which has the class blue on an element inside an element that has the class red. If you want the same styles to apply to different sets of selectors, then you can list your selector groups with commas. There are also pseudo classes that'll do something special, like the hover class, which lets you define what happens when the mouse hovers over something, or the after and before pseudo classes that let you add something before and after an element. These are often used with the content property. You can also use other HTML attributes as selectors, such as the type on an input field. So now that we know how to reach our elements, let's manipulate them with some CSS properties. The easiest way to work with CSS is to define it directly in the browser tools, such as the Chrome Inspector, and add your CSS there. Then once it works, you can copy it into your code editor to use it on a site. Possibly the most important property to understand in CSS is the box model. Every HTML element has some content with a size. Around the content there's padding, and around the padding there's a border. Around the border there is a margin. The padding decides the difference between the content and the border, and the margin decides the space from the border to the next element. The margin can be negative if you want elements to overlap, or if you want to push something partially off the screen. The border can either be solid, dotted, or dashed, and you can use the border radius to make element corners round even when they don't have visible borders. Now let's talk about positioning. Here's a box and some text. I want the text next to the box, so I tell the box to float left or right. I can also set the position attribute to relative to define the space between the sides of my parent element. Setting it to absolute gives it a position within the window regardless of where the parent element is placed. Or set it to fixed, which fixes it in the window so it comes with you when you scroll, regardless of what's on the page. When you do this, you'll get elements that overlap, so you can use the setIndex property to set the layers of each element. Colors can be defined using keywords such as red, blue, and black, using hex values, starting with a hashtag and then using 3 hex values between 00 and FF to represent numbers between 0 and 255. That's the default way to define colors on web. You can also set them using RGB values, which also uses values from 0 to 255 for red, green, and blue, And you can use RGBA values, which do the same thing but let you add opacity of the color. You can alter your text using font weight to set how bold the text is going to be, or set it to be italic, using the font style property. You can use text align to say if your text should be on the left, on the right, if it should be centered or justified. If you want to change fonts, you can do it using the font family property. If you do that in a tool like Visual Studio Code, it'll suggest the available web-safe fonts. If you want to use a custom font, you can find one on Google Fonts and import it into your HTML and then use it with the font family property. You can also import Font Awesome if you want to work with icons. This could be useful if you want to make checklists where the bullet points are replaced with check marks or something like that. You can use the media rule to define CSS that only applies to certain screen sizes, or CSS that only applies when a page is printed out. And you can use the keyframe rule to define an animation that you can then use with the animation property. In the keyframe animation, you can set keyframes at percentages of the time defined in the animation attribute, and the browser will animate its way from keyframe to keyframe before landing on the final CSS. If the animation property contains the keyword infinite, the animation will start over once it has reached its final design. And that's it. If you can do this, you have a great handle on CSS. We skipped a number of topics such as grids, flex boxes, shadows, rotation, skewing, filters, custom shapes, and a whole lot more. But these are all specific properties that are not used nearly as much as what we just went through. If you want a more detailed version of this video, there's a link for that in the description. If you enjoyed this quickie format, please let both me and YouTube know by clicking that like button. And of course, the other quickies are linked in the description along with the full CSS course. So that's going to be it for this video, and I'll see you next time.